Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. In the midst of seismic global developments, mounting challenges in the United States, and a surge in anti-Semitism, joining us today is AJC CEO David Harris, one of the Jewish world's leading experts on global trends, who will take us around the world to discuss some of the key issues that AJC is focusing on. Described by the late Israeli president, Shimon Peres, as the foreign minister of the Jewish people, David has led AJC since 1990. Moderating this conversation is David Harris's Chief of Staff, Bel Yoeli. After we hear from David and Bel, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A chat feature in Zoom. Bel, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Jillian. Hello, everyone. And David, as always, it's good to be with you.
Likewise.
I'm going to take an around the world tour today to try to discuss some of the key issues that AJC is focusing on and that obviously are on our CEO, David's mind. David, with your permission, I'd like to begin right here at home. I know you spend a lot of time thinking about trends in this country and around the world and that affect our core mission and our values. What are some of the trends starting here in the US that are on your mind, that are keeping you up at night, and that AJC is monitoring closely at this moment in time?
First of all, Bel, hello, and hello to our worldwide audience. And in Hollywood, they gave the opportunity for Around the World in 80 days. That was the name of the classic film. I don't even get 80 minutes, so I'll take the time that we have together. Here in this country, there are several sort of concerning trends. The most obvious, I think, is sort of the evaporation of social cohesion, the notion of some kind of national consensus. In American history, obviously there have been many differences, and of course, the Civil War. But we've always relied, since the Civil War, on a certain degree of commonality as a nation that kind of kept us together and that managed the differences. And of course, for much of that time in the US Congress, even with sometimes sharp differences between the political parties, there were many legislators who were looking for that overlap, that kind of common space where people could negotiate, eventually compromise, and be able to move on. I'm very concerned, Bel, that Americans seem increasingly entrenched in their corners, and those corners are farther and farther apart. In fact, if you go into sort of the intellectual ecosystem of each of the corners, and I do, into their social media, into their favorite TV shows, into their favorite websites, they're really describing two different countries with two very different perspectives. And for me, irrespective of where I personally might fit on that political spectrum, I and we have a stake in sort of managing the center and managing that public space where people can come together, air their differences with civility, with respect for each other, and ultimately move on. And right now, that space is rare, and I think that's quite dangerous.
Thank you, David. And I'm curious because obviously you've experienced many different phases within the United States as anyone in your position at AJC, and also
my age, you can say it.
And your age. I wasn't going to say it. You can.
I can say it.
I'm a little behind you. So we're hearing these phenomenons of cancel culture, and for the first time, and at least that I've seen, really questioning the openness of ideas, and as we've heard a lot in the last few weeks, the free marketplace of ideas that have made up the American experience. How does that fit into what you're describing, and how is AJC navigating that? Because it seems to be very new and concerning for a lot of us.
Well, in some respects, it's new for your generation, without question. But for those of my generation, there were certain sort of familiar pieces to this from the late 60s and early 70s, when America became deeply divided, very polarized, frankly quite violent. We had political assassinations. We had the killing of the 4 students at Kent State. We had massive urban rioting from Newark to Detroit to parts of Los Angeles and well beyond. Really, 2 separate camps with 2 separate intellectual ecosystems, with 2 completely different views of America's place in the world, America's sense of self. So today is a little different, but not entirely different. So for my generation, there are certain familiar elements to this. So where do we go from here? Right now, I mean, we actually have 2 very different emerging histories of this country. So it's no longer just kind of temporal. It's no longer just about the moment or the period since May 25th when George Floyd was so brutally murdered in Minneapolis. We're going much further back in American history, with one narrative essentially saying that America was, is, and remains a fundamentally racist project. I mean, in which race is central and in fact, in many respects, defining of American history. And another important segment of America that says, we agree with you on the brutality of the murder. We agree with you that there may be police excess, that there is police excess, but we're not prepared to subscribe to that fundamental theory that this country, over the last 400 years, and by extension us, are therefore all racist, and that defines who and what we are. So 2 very different views. And again, when you have this kind of polarization, Bill, you have to segment even the polarized. So in the polarized, if you will, you have, let's call it the soft right and the soft left, but you also have the hard right and you have the hard left. The hard right, I refer to as the radical right. That's the community of people who marched in Charlottesville using Nazi themes, that welcomed the murders in Charleston at the AME Church, or at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or the Chabad Synagogue in Poway. The hard right that is essentially white supremacist, racist to its core, and armed in many cases. I mean, this country is awash in weapons to begin with. It's a larger question. And then you have the soft left, but then you have what I call the totalitarian left. And the totalitarian left rejects the liberal notion of what this country ought to be, namely a place where free speech is protected, where we listen to each other, where we negotiate with each other, where we compromise with each other. And instead, the totalitarian left wants to shut this all down. And at times has used violence, as we've seen, again, on the streets. I mean, the place in which I live was attacked. The storefronts were attacked. A pet store, if you can imagine, was attacked and looted as part of the violence, not to mention the statues and the confrontations with the police and others. So the soft left and the soft right need to be very careful. Historically, they are people with good intentions. However they interpret their political philosophy, they have good intentions. But history has shown that the radical right and the totalitarian left could, over time, try to swallow the soft right and the soft left. So I think this is quite not just a serious, this is quite a defining and in some respects dangerous period in American history. And I don't think it's going to go away so quickly.
I tend to agree with you, David. And let me follow up with 2 more questions specifically on the United States. So narrowing in on this unique and frightening environment that we're living in, I think the Jewish community, a lot of us over the past few weeks and months have felt some sort of whiplash in that we knew that anti-Semitism has reemerged to a certain degree. We very much had racial justice and these questions on our minds because the Black Lives Matter movement and everything that happened with George Floyd and others, as you mentioned, was so fresh in the news. And then all of a sudden, at least speaking in my own experience, celebrities and other mainstream figures, we saw this wave in the past few weeks, especially on social media, of perpetuating anti-Semitism or raising voices, elevating voices of known anti-Semites, and the community feeling very surprised and not understanding kind of where is this coming from? Why is this gaining traction? Why now? How does this fit into everything else that's happening? What should our audience be thinking? What do they need to know? And how do we navigate this idea, this scary idea that anti-Semitism could become commonplace in pop culture and American culture with all the other forms of bigotry? How do we navigate these very difficult moments?
Not easily. And I think you used a very appropriate word, Belle, when you spoke about whiplash. And I think that's especially true for American Jews of your generation, a few years older and a few years younger as well, because essentially the American in which you grew up was an American in which there was very, very few manifestations of anti-Semitism. And generally speaking, when they were quite distant. And you might see something online, you might hear about something somewhere else. But by and large, if I can generalize, most younger American Jews were blessed to grow up in America where there were no barriers to their full participation in American life. Not on the street, not in schools, not in universities, not in law firms, not in Fortune 500 companies, wherever they were going, which was itself an improved contrast to their parents' and their grandparents' lived experiences. So whiplash is exactly the right term for your generation. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. I wish there were. It would mean a much shorter reply to your question. But I think a number of things are converging. And among the things that are converging are something I referred to earlier. When extremes emerge, as they have, and again, I'm calling them the radical right and the totalitarian left, and numerically, I can't judge their size, but I can tell you that in terms of their voice is being magnified. It's being magnified because, first of all, social media permits this megaphone. They're being magnified because they're much more newsworthy than people in the center, who tend not to make news because they tend to be either quiet or nuanced, and therefore much less interest in the media. And when you have the radical right, for example, on the ascendancy, at least for now, or populism on the ascendancy, then for that group, whoever their first target may be, it could be Jews, it could be African Americans, it could be Muslims, it could be LGBTQ, but as Jews, we know we're on the list. We know we're on the list. And of course, for the radical right, we're on the list as the other, because we don't qualify for their purity tests. Now, the irony of all of this, of course, is for them, we also are embodied by images of, say, Karl Marx. Then you swing over to the totalitarian left, and what do you see there? Well, you see that on their list, we represent white privilege. We are embodied by the Rothschilds, by sort of economic success, which in today's world is seen, at least in that part of the spectrum, as somehow suspicious and dirty. So first of all, we're on the list of both, which is not new in history. Secondly, being on the list of both illustrates again the irrationality of anti-Semitism and the difficulty of trying to argue directly with anti-Semites. Because for one crowd, we're Karl Marx. For the second crowd, we're the Rothschilds. Now, I think I can say safely that Karl Marx and the Rothschilds could not exist easily under one roof. For one side, we represent white privilege, white supremacy, the establishment, For the other side, we represent the outsider, the other, the untrustworthy. So you can't win, which is all the more reason I come back to, to AJC centrism. Centrism is, as we define it at AJC, is not a person who's in need of a glass of water standing equidistant between two glasses of water and dying of thirst, because he can't decide, do I go to this glass or do I go to that glass? I'm not talking about a paralyzed centrism. I'm not talking about a centrism that says, I don't know how to make a decision. I'm talking about a centrism that says, we need to hold the center of this country together. We cannot allow this country to break apart. That's the space that AJC holds. So I would call it from the soft left, of the moderate left to the moderate right. That's our space. And that's the space not only that we have to defend, Bell, but that's the space that has to hold the line on pluralism. Not just on fighting anti-Semitism, although yes, fighting anti-Semitism, we need allies. Anti-Semitism targets Jews, but it's not a Jewish problem. It doesn't originate among Jews. But hey, I mean, I hope those watching this all know this by now, but whoever went to Charleston, South Carolina to kill those 9 worshipers, African-American worshipers on that day, I can assure you, had the synagogue been next door and the mosque been next door, and had he had the opportunity, he would have very happily attacked the synagogue and the mosque alongside the AME church. And the same in Pittsburgh. Had there been a mosque alongside the Tree of Life synagogue, and again, had the opportunity presented itself, he would have gone equally. So the point is a point which Martin Luther King understood. It's a point which John Lewis, who passed away just a few days ago, understood. It's a point that AJC understands. Anti-Semitism is a disease which all people of goodwill need to fight, because it's a disease that threatens us all, just as racism threatens us all. Because ultimately, the perpetrators have a very different vision of our country and our society than the rest of us do. So we're all in this together.
So speaking of centrism, David, in the US context and in the Jewish context, in the last few weeks, there was a lot of news around Israel, both in the Democratic Party platform, which I can only describe as the headlines being that the platform was quite positive towards Israel, which I guess for some was a surprise, or some weren't happy with that. And at the same time, there was news around the concept of the very well, Beinar article, which essentially, in essence, called for the end of Israel as we know it and the creation of a one-state solution. So place this into context for us, both of those pieces, within trying to keep the center on Israel, and kind of what should our viewers take away from where the US-Israel relationship is, and where maybe Americans are on these issues?
Well, first of all, clearly the far more important issue is, in this case, what the Democratic Party platform says, and not what a journalist, Beinart, says. But just to deal with Beinart for a moment, he didn't, in essence, say, he said it point of fact, that Jewish sovereignty is over, as far as he's concerned. It's over. After 72 years and after thousands of years of dreaming and praying and yearning, it's over. Because as far as he's concerned, Jews don't need a state. A home will be sufficient. A home which includes also a large Palestinian population, and that somehow these two communities will coexist in some new country and defy every other historical example in the region. And otherwise, Jewish agency, Jewish self-determination is over, because someone on the west side of Manhattan or east side, wherever he may live, has decided from 5,000 miles away that this is his vision. Frankly, I couldn't care what his vision is. It's irrelevant to me. What's relevant to me is that the New York Times chose to publish the piece and give it the importance which, frankly, I don't think it deserved. I don't recall the last time the New York Times published a piece on its op-ed page, and I read it carefully, that called for the dismantling of any other nation on earth, nor would I expect it to. But again, for some strange reason, the New York Times felt this was worthy of being published. And so it was given a certain ephemeral importance, but is otherwise irrelevant. 9 million Israelis are not going to give up their state because one journalist 5,000 miles away is now disappointed with the project. His problem. The Democratic Party platform, though, is another matter, and obviously there was concern, Bill, as you hinted, namely because of this Kulturkampf, this kind of culture war inside the Democratic Party between, if you will, the moderate wing and the progressive wing, or however you wish to name the wings. Yes, the party wants to unite on November 3rd and oust Donald Trump, but that unity cannot mask the disunity. Disunity that led, for example, to Eliot Engel, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, being challenged in a primary and being ousted by someone to his political left. And there are other examples of Democrats fighting Democrats in primaries, or looking over their shoulder at what may happen in 2022. And also jockeying for position should Joe Biden win in terms of the balance of power between, again, if you will, the so-called moderate Democratic establishment and the more activist, woke, progressive, left-wing, whatever you wish to call it, wing of the party. So the story goes on. As far as the platform is concerned on Israel, it's pretty good. From my perspective, is it perfect? No, but it's pretty good. It affirms the importance and centrality of the U.S.-Israel relationship. It reflects a lot of Joe Biden's personal career and personal commitment to the U.S.-Israel relationship, which goes back at least 50 years. It reflects the mainstream. And I think that that's a victory for the Democratic Party, and that's a victory for all of us who are friends of the U.S.-Israel relationship. So in that respect, it's fine. On the last part of your question on centrism, as it applies to the U.S.-Israel relationship, you mentioned the issue of annexation. And when the issue first came up, we were not so sure that it was going to go forward. You know, there was a kind of immediate reaction in many places. We took our time to understand whether this was really serious, whether this was a political ploy, what the timing on this would be, what the scope of this would be. And lo and behold, here we are in end of July, and nothing has yet happened. Having said that, though, we did make clear, I made clear, that we would oppose any unilateral annexation by an Israeli government on the West Bank. First of all, Israel's already in control of the West Bank, so we're not exactly sure what this would add to it. Secondly, it's not going to make the search for a return to the peace talks any easier, and it's certainly going to give the Palestinians who managed to stay away from the peace table year after year, you know, a wonderful excuse to do so, and it's going to elicit, you know, a reaction surely in parts of the Arab world, in Europe, and certainly here in the United States. But having said that, I think it's fair to ask another question. Again, AJC centrism, AJC complexity, AJC nuance. The second question, which doesn't take away from what I just said, is how long is Israel supposed to wait for a serious Palestinian partner? I mean, it is now 53 years, Bill. We go back again to the late 60s. It's 53 years since the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War was a war of self-defense for the very survival of the state of Israel. Again, for those who may not have been alive or don't know the history, in 1967, there were no settlements. There was, however, the PLO. The PLO had been founded 3 years earlier in 1964 and explicitly called for the destruction of the state of Israel. That was part of its charter. So the war that was inflicted upon Israel by these blood-curdling threats from Egypt and from Syria, joined by other Arab capitals, was to destroy the state, not to negotiate from a position of strength on the settlements or on the borders, to destroy the state. 53 years later, we still don't have a serious Palestinian partner who's prepared to sit down with the Israelis and negotiate to the very end, meaning to an end of conflict, negotiation, and conclusion. It's over. We don't have it. Now, some will say, well, what about Oslo, 1993? What about Yasser Arafat? And to that, I would say, I, for one, never believed Arafat was serious and sincere. I think history proved that because 8 months after he signed the Camp David Accords, he was in Johannesburg, South Africa. He was caught on tape, unbeknownst to him, in a mosque, in which he very clearly said that signing the Oslo Accords was a tactic. It was a tactic. It was a tactic to gain something, but the struggle continued. And since then, as we know, there have been proposals put on the table. Bill Clinton writes about it in his autobiography, My Life. We know about the Ehud Olmert experience. We know about the Ariel Sharon withdrawal from Gaza. So how long is Israel supposed to wait? And by the way, I would add again, how many times in history has the winning party in a war waited for the defeated party in war to come to the table to make terms that would address the minimum demands of the defeated party? The defeated party. If we're going around the world, we can go around the world and point to territorial acquisition by country after country in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, in other parts of the world that were the result of war. To the victor goes the spoils. Here, it's quite different. And so we're saying two things need to coexist. One, Israel, in our judgment, should not take unilateral steps on the West Bank. On the other hand, it's fair to ask, will Israel have a peace partner? And if Israel does not have a peace partner anytime soon, what is Israel supposed to do absent that peace partner?
Well, David, we're going to come back to Israel and the Middle East and hopefully the rest of the world. But let's step back while looking globally for a moment. I want to ask you a similar question to what I asked you about the United States, which is, are there particular global trends that are on your mind that are keeping you up at night or on AJC's mind at this moment?
Well, actually, there are several global trends, and that's why, I've learned in life, Bell, that sleep is overrated. So, if I don't sleep, then I don't have to be woken up by fear of certain global trends. I'm awake. Look, the most obvious one now, but one we've been talking about at AJC for several years, is China. China writ large, and in particular, the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, which we have been saying for at least the last number of years will be the single most important bilateral relationship defining the 21st century. And it's going to be a challenge for any U.S. administration. Democrat, Republican, Biden, Trump, or whoever their successors are going to be, it's going to be a profound geopolitical challenge each and every day. I believe, at least from the perspective of 2020, Bell, how to manage the U.S.-China relationship. There clearly are going to be profound differences. There are going to be tensions. There are going to be clashes. There are today. And yet at the very same time, we have to identify and seek to work on areas where we must cooperate. And I mean, two in that second category to me are quite obvious. One are pandemics, and the second is environmental issues and climate change. Both of those issues, we should have learned by now, cannot be solved by any one nation. And only if the two most powerful nations on earth come together do we have a chance. But on other issues, issues from Hong Kong to Taiwan to the South China Sea to Huawei and 5G, to the Uyghurs, to intellectual property. There's going to be a long list that will face any administration, whether it's Joe Biden on January 20th or it's a re-elected Donald Trump. And how to manage this relation is going to present, I think, as my kids used to say, a ginormous and a permanent challenge for whoever the next president of the United States is. So that to me is global trend number one. Number two is the declining confidence in liberal democracy as a model. It's interesting that it was some 25 years or so ago that we welcomed the book by Francis Fukuyama called The End of History. And his essential thesis, as I recall, was with the defeat of communism, with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, history had finally shown that the ultimate victor was liberal democracy. That this Soviet empire, begun in 1917, just could not sustain it. It didn't have enough gas in the tank in order to compete with the Western world. And therefore, the end of history really meant the permanence of liberal democracy. Oh, and by the way, tying it to China, that China would nominally continue its particular political style, its vertical political style, but that its growing globalization, its participation in the World Trade Organization, its One Belt, One Road strategy, all would kind of moderate its behavior at the edges and allow China to work within the global system. So it wasn't quite the liberal democratic model, but it somehow could coexist with a liberal democratic model. Now fast forward, and we see this resurgence of populism, this declining confidence in a number of liberal democracies, in part because of mismanagement of COVID-19, which revealed huge gaping holes in a number of countries. While some countries did well, other countries did disastrously. And lo and behold, not everyone is drawn to the model of liberal democracy. Some people say, under the circumstances, the authoritarian model may make more sense, more centralization. So I worry deeply about that. And of course, as a proud Jew, I worry about the fact that anti-Semitism is not just rising, as you said earlier, in the United States, but it's continuing to rise globally, particularly in Europe as well. And I worry as a Jew for myself, for my children and my grandchildren, and for a larger world, which still, after thousands of years, literally thousands of years, cannot entirely and fully come to terms with the presence of some 15 million Jews on the planet. Stop to think about it. There are well over 7.5 billion people on the planet. Jews comprise about 1/500th of the global population. 1/500th. Roughly 15 million people. Okay, so we make noise for double to compensate for our small size. And yet, this perennial, persistent issue of anti-Semitism, whether it takes the form of the deep-rooted anti-Zionism or class warfare on one side, or the neo-Nazi, racialist, supremacist view on the other side, or it takes the form of jihadism on the third side. I mean, to me, it's stunning that here we are in the year 2020, and once again, even after the legacy of the Holocaust and where it led, we Jews once again have to make sure that our synagogues are protected, our schools are protected, that our children understand the pride in being Jewish, but the need for courage in being Jewish. It's stunning to me, and that keeps me up at night.
Thank you, David, for kind of setting the stage for us. And I wish we had time to get to all of these. We'll try. Since
Let's
you
do
began,
it in 80 days next time.
Since you began with China, let me follow up on that. As you know very well, China and Iran made headlines this week and are said to be finalizing an agreement of 400 billion, I think, of economic and security money, a deal, which many analysts are saying could give China not only a new huge source of different resources and a foothold in the Gulf, but obviously that concerns us for a different reason because of Iran and a huge cash flow and what that means for Iran's capabilities as a state sponsor of terrorism, for its nuclear program. Can you touch on your thoughts on that relationship and, as I mentioned, what it means for our concerns towards Iran more broadly?
Yes. Well, first of all, for those who want to join me in sort of staying up at night or waking up at night worried, on October 18th, which is in less than 90 days, legally, under the terms of the Iranian nuclear deal negotiated in 2015, legally, Iran will now be able both to buy weapons and to sell weapons. So we need to understand we're moving into a different era, which has been sanctioned by the Iranian nuclear deal. Number one, China steps into the vacuum right away and sees this huge market and this huge opportunity to gain more influence and more dependency on Iranian energy sources for China's large and growing economy. And the United States, which of course left the Iranian nuclear deal, and one can argue whether it was right or not to leave the Iranian nuclear deal, but the fact remains that whether or not the US was in the deal, the arms embargo ends on October the 18th. And that's something we need to worry about. More broadly, we need to worry about the fact that, at least in our judgment at AJC, Iran has never been sincere in its compliance to the Iranian nuclear deal. And that's why we studied the deal. We took about 3 weeks, actually it was, I think, 23 days, before we took a position on the deal, unlike many who kind of made it a litmus test of whether they supported or opposed Barack Obama. Those who supported Barack Obama, in many cases, kind of robotically endorsed the deal. Those who opposed Barack Obama automatically opposed the deal. AJC is not in this about politics. We're not in this to support our favorite political party. We are nonpartisan, we are independent, but we are deeply concerned about where Iran fits on the strategic map. And we take very seriously, and history should lead all of us to take seriously, that when Iranian leaders say clearly, unambiguously, we seek a world without Israel, we have to take them seriously. And when they arm their proxies, in particular Hezbollah, right on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, and when Syria becomes a second home for Iranian forces, and arms caches and manufacturing facilities, we have to take them seriously. So what China is doing here is strengthening Iran at a time when the United States is trying to weaken Iran. And here again, we're headed for another clash. Now, in the meantime, there are other parties which are not waiting for the outcome of that clash and are not waiting for October 18th and are not waiting to see how the rest of the deal unfolds. They're taking action into their own hands. And there have been, according to news reports, at least a dozen that I've heard about, attacks, acts of sabotage in Iran, in Natanz, against advanced centrifuges, against other facilities. I'll leave it to everyone's imagination who could be behind this, who has an interest in slowing this down. I have no doubt that there are Iranian opposition forces that at least welcome this. I have no doubt that there are many in the Sunni Arab world, in Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Gulf, who welcome this. I have no doubt that there are many in Israel and the United States who welcome this. But left to its own devices, Iran will continue to be a regional destabilizer, a funder of terrorism, a threat not just to Israel, but to the entire region and beyond, a suppressor of human rights. And even the most diehard supporters of the Iranian nuclear deal, I think, have to confront these realities. That the deal for them may, in their own mind, have slowed this process down, It has not solved the problem. And I'll add one more thing, Bell, because I had the privilege of meeting with the principal authors of the deal very, very privately and on more than one occasion as they tried to persuade AJC to support the deal. Again, a benefit of centrism, because we didn't react robotically. How we came down on the deal was really important because we approached these things independently. But their view of the deal was that it would be transformational. Now they're rewriting history to say, no, it was really transactional. It was the narrow subject of the nuclear portfolio, not the rest. But at the time, and I heard it with my own ears in small settings from the very top, this would change Iranian behavior. This would strengthen the so-called moderates. And I even heard references that President Rouhani, seen as the moderate in Iran, joined by Foreign Minister Zarif, could be analogized to President Gorbachev and to Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, who had overseen the transition of the Soviet Union from the totalitarian model to the reformist model, and ultimately, of course, to the end of the Soviet Union. I think any fair-minded person needs to sort of revisit these issues and say, you know what, we may have overestimated the impact of the deal. We may have overestimated our own illusions, self-delusions about Iran. It poses a danger. And not just because the Trump administration withdrew from the deal. That's its own debate. I accept that. That's its own debate. But it's not the only debate. And to make that the only debate allows too many to lift responsibility from Iran and very conveniently put it on the shoulders of the American administration. I think that would be simplistic and unfair. And Bell, are you there? Are you frozen?
Apologies to our viewers. It seems like we're having some technical difficulties.
So Jillian, back to you.
Thank you. Bell, are you back?
I'm so sorry there. My internet cut out for a moment. So
I thought it was something I said.
It was not. As we all know, this is the Zoom climate that we are living in. Okay. David, I missed the end of your comment, but I know you were talking about the need to pay close attention to Iran and for some to reconsider perhaps our view.
Well, let's keep going. Let's leave Iran and keep going.
Okay. Well, I can't leave Iran because I have to ask you a follow-up which relates to Iran and into two different areas of the world. So the first is last week. I'm losing sense of time, but I believe last week and the week before, there were past 2 weeks for us, there were some related topics. One was that we hosted the president of Argentina to commemorate the 26th anniversary of the AMIA attack in Buenos Aires, the center of Jewish life, which has an Iran connection. And then also last week, we had our AJC's Transatlantic Institute and its partner body of lawmakers, Transatlantic Friends of Israel, launched this historic transatlantic declaration on Hezbollah, urging the EU with over, I believe, 220 lawmakers to ban Hezbollah and label it in its entirety as a terrorist organization. So very much, as you mentioned, these pieces of Iran and its activities are popping up text. How does this all fit together, especially in the European case? Well, why is this so important in this moment?
Well, it's important, firstly, because it again underscores the point. For those who want to pretend that Iran is only a Middle East issue, or more specifically an Israel issue, it goes well beyond. And the two attacks in Argentina, first in 1992 against the Israeli embassy, in which 29 people were killed, and then in 1994 against the AMIA, the central Jewish building of Buenos Aires, in which 85 people were killed, sort of underscores the point. And by the way, I need to stress that in both attacks, Jews and non-Jews were killed, not to mention injured as well. And in both cases, it so happens that I knew people in both buildings on the day of the attack. So it was also very personal. The other point that it illustrates is that Hezbollah is the handmaiden of Iran. Hezbollah was involved in the attacks in Argentina. It showed the reach of Hezbollah as a global terror organization, also able to draw on sort of local moles, local connections, and so we had last week the president of Argentina that AJC hosted to mark the 26th anniversary of the Amia bombing. That in itself was a very significant event, that he would sit with AJC for 45 minutes and talk about these issues. And he talked about Iran, and he talked about Hezbollah. And in fact, Argentina recently listed Hezbollah on its terrorism list. It became one of 5 Latin American countries to list Hezbollah as a terror organization, which means that part of AJC diplomacy is to ask the other Latin American countries, neighbors, friends, allies, colleagues of Argentina, show your support. These were the worst terror attacks in Latin America in so many years. So Colombia, Paraguay, Guatemala, Honduras, together with Argentina, are the 5 countries, and of course the United States and Canada. When it comes to Europe, we have another issue. In 2013, finally, the EU decided to act against Hezbollah. I say finally because we, AJC, and I personally spent at least 20 years before 2013 urging our friends in Europe to act against Hezbollah as a terror organization. And they rationalized, and they deferred, and they delayed, and they obfuscated. But in 2013, Hezbollah was caught red-handed in 2 EU countries. Not in the Middle East, 2 EU countries, Bulgaria and Cyprus. And from that point on, it was impossible for Brussels to ignore Hezbollah. But in their infinite creativity, what did they do? The then 28 member states. They bifurcated Hezbollah. They created an artificial division between a political and a military wing. And they listed the military wing, not the political wing. So a half a step is better than no step. But for the last 7 years, we've been pressing for the second step. And our Brussels office, which we call our Transatlantic Institute office, launched this wonderful initiative called Transatlantic Friends of Israel. European parliamentarians joining with their colleagues in Washington and in Jerusalem as this trifecta. And one of their first issues was to address the Hezbollah issue. And last Friday, we had a virtual press conference to announce that over 230 parliamentarians are calling on the European Union to ban all of Hezbollah. And they are European parliamentarians of a range of political parties who have banded together because they can't accept this anomaly, if not this absurdity. And they also cited the fact that on April 30th, Germany, to its credit, became the 3rd European country after the Netherlands and the United Kingdom to act nationally and to say, we are banning all Hezbollah activity on our soil. So we keep going. We keep going with our friends in Latin America. We keep going with our friends in Europe because Hezbollah is such a clear-cut issue. It should be a no-brainer. And of course, it takes us one step closer to its patron and its sponsor, Iran.
Thank you, David. Since we're quickly running out of time, I'm going to turn to audience questions. And with apologies to everyone who's asking questions, I'm going to focus on the geopolitical questions since this is about around the world. So to begin, David, Stafi, actually writing in from Athens, noticed, rightfully so, that you were on an event on Monday, along with the foreign minister of Cyprus and many senior members of the US Congress, including Nancy Pelosi, to talk about the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, commemorating that time, and the broader Eastern Mediterranean. So why is this particular topic important to you and to AJC when we're looking at that region? And also, he asks, why is a Jewish organization even involved in this type of topic, which I think you'll particularly enjoy answering.
I will, and I only wish I had a few more hours to answer it, because this is a question close to my heart. Look, firstly, This goes back to the early 1980s and AJC strategic vision. And that was a time when Greece, Cyprus, and Israel, who are geographically close to one another, were politically very distant from one another. And that was mostly because of domestic politics in Greece and in Cyprus, on the one hand. And in the case of Israel, yes, a desire for relations, but much more emphasis on the relationship with Turkey. We believed at AJC, we believed that it was important to bring these three countries together, Greece, Cyprus, and Israel. And the more they would come together, the more they would find the logic of why they ought to deepen their relationship. Well, it's a long story, but fast forward, today, those three countries form what they call a strategic triangle. So it's not just a relationship of tourism and cultural exchange and trade. It is a strategic triangle anchoring the interests of Europe, the democratic nations, and the United States in the Eastern Med. And of course, this is extraordinarily important for Israel as well. Meanwhile, Turkey has been flexing its muscles, and profoundly so, in a variety of ways, which we have found to be destructive to the region. We had long been friends with Turkey. I've been to Ankara many, many times. In 1999, I had the privilege of being in a place called Adapazarı, together with Ekrem Barak, Israel's prime minister, and the Turkish prime minister, and the three of us were the speakers to open a village, which AJC helped build. We built a school in that village after an earthquake had destroyed the whole city of Adapazarı. That's how close we were. But under President Erdogan, he developed close relations with Iran. He developed close relations with Russia. He began to distance himself from Israel. He began to become a patron of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. He began to challenge Greece in the Aegean. He began to violate Cyprus's exclusive economic zone, and more and more and more. When we speak about global trends, this is an important global trend. It directly affects American, European, and Israeli interests. It directly affects whether a regional bully, in this case, Turkey's President Erdogan, will get away with his behavior, which, by the way, now extends as far as Libya. And for those who are interested in watching global trends, I urge you to pay more attention today to Libya, to what's going on there, to the divisions in Libya, to the troops from various countries that are showing up in Libya. And what Erdogan has tried to do as well is draw a new maritime map of the Mediterranean, which essentially defines the borders of Turkey and Libya as conjoined in the Mediterranean, as if Cyprus did not exist, as if Greece did not exist. So this is one place to watch. And yes, it may seem far away and to some quite obscure, but it has profound implications, again, for America, for Europe, for Israel, for our friends in Greece and Cyprus, and for democracy.
Thank you, David. And I'm glad you mentioned Libya, because we did get a lot of questions about Libya. We didn't get to everything in every place in the world, but I'm going to ask you one final question, because actually a lot of people have asked similar questions, including Samantha in Miami, Jean in Dallas, and actually another question similar coming in from Tel Aviv. So David, fast forward to the presidential election and after the election in the United States. And it's January of 2021, and you're meeting with either President Trump again or newly elected President Joe Biden. Either way, what would be your advice to offer as someone clearly involved and invested in experience in global affairs to the next cycle president? What would you say?
I would welcome that opportunity, obviously, and I would walk in as a nonpartisan who is a deeply patriotic American and who wants what's best for America and not for a political party in America. So I don't bring any political baggage to the meeting. America must reassert our global leadership. America must reassert our global brand as a democratic nation that serves as a model and an example to others of not just the pursuit of our interests, but the pursuit of our values. That in the world in which we're living, we cannot, should not, and must not go it alone. Obviously, every country pursues its national interests. A small country like Luxembourg or a big country like the United States. However, there are certain issues which do not respect borders, cannot be contained within borders. We need partners. We need partners who are allies, who are trusted over the years, on whom we can depend. And we need other nations where we may not have that level of trust, but we can work together on certain issues. But we need an approach that says we cannot and must not go it alone. We also need to understand how to balance, and it's always a difficult balance, the combination of hard power and soft power. Soft power alone, dialogue, cooperation, multilateralism is important, it's essential, but it won't get us where we need to go without credible, convincing hard power. One always hopes that the hard power will never have to be used. But absent the hard power in the real world of international relations and not in the illusory world of my own home, hard power is necessary as an adjunct to soft power. And not only do you have to possess hard power, you have to be able to convince your potential and real adversaries that if necessary, you'll use the power. And if you're not able to convince them that you're ready to use the power, then the soft power is weakened and the hard power becomes largely meaningless. So whether it's a re-elected Donald Trump or whether it's Joe Biden, my messages would be the same. And of course, if I could get more specific for one moment from these sort of loftier themes, within that and within the need to engage with our allies, that includes, of course, the centrality of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I will always stress, not as some kind of gift to Israel, but rather as representing the highest both values and interests of American foreign policy. Israel is not only the one liberal democracy in the region, but Israel is a country that has done more for the United States than many Americans understand in the realms of you name it, science and technology, medical research, cybersecurity, counterterrorism, national resilience, defense cooperation, go down the list. We need to stand by our allies and very clearly, and they need to have the confidence that we stand by them. So I don't know how much time I get with Joe Biden. I don't know how much time I get with Donald Trump. But before I would drill down into other issues, those would be the main themes, Bill.
David, thank you so much, as always, for your insights. And again, I apologize to our viewers. There were a lot of questions we didn't get to. We try, but I can assure you there will be other around the world sessions. As we all know very well, these challenges are unfortunately not going away, even though we do our best to make them go away. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jillian to close us out.
Thank you, Belle and David, for such a wide-ranging conversation and for taking us around the world. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one and so we can continue our advocacy work around the world on behalf of the Jewish people. Visit ajc.org/donate. Please join us for our next Advocacy Anywhere program featuring Senator Norm Coleman, the national chairman of the Republican Jewish Coalition, for an assessment of his party's 2020 prospects in this sought-after constituency. This program will take place on Monday, July 27th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. To register for this program and to stay up to date on all Advocacy Anywhere programs, please visit ajc.org/advocacyanywhere. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you. Goodbye.